Hello, thank you so much for tuning into this virtual workshop for Forest Ontario's Envirothon. My name is Lam, and I'll be delivering the Forestry workshop focusing on forest measurement, which will include tree ID and tree measurement. So some background on me. I'm an all-around tree nerd. I discovered my passion for trees in undergrad and wound up pursuing a master's in forest conservation. After wrapping up my studies, I was fortunate enough to become the education coordinator for LEAF, a local nonprofit based in Toronto that focuses on growing and sustaining the urban forest through planting, education, and stewardship. LEAF operates in Toronto and throughout the GTA, and my role as the education coordinator is to organize our educational programming. But today, I'm simply here to impart some of my own knowledge from one tree nerd to another. I hope that at the end, you'll walk away with some skills that can be applied to the trees in your own community. So let's get started. For this workshop, we'll start off with a little bit of tree physiology before we transition into different species characteristics. From there, we'll learn how to use a dichotomous key, and then we'll wrap up with tree measurement. At the end of the workshop, I hope that you'll be able to describe the different parts of a tree, explain the difference between tree types, be able to identify key species in Ontario, or at least be familiar with some features. You'll be able to utilize a dichotomous key to identify a tree, and demonstrate how to measure a tree. So you tuned into a forestry workshop, but what does this word really encompass? Some people think about tree planting, others imagine tree hugging, and understandably some think of it as simply cutting down trees. Now each of these interpretations is right to a degree. Forestry has come a really long way since the axe-wielding, plaid-wearing early lumberjack days where trees were seen as an endless resource. Today, forestry is a complex and multidisciplinary field that is both an art and a science into managing, utilizing, conserving, and restoring forests. So when you boil it all down, forestry is simply people who love trees and work with them. So what exactly are trees? Well, trees can be defined as woody perennial plants that are at least 4.5 to 5 meters tall, depending on the definition. Trees also have a number of key components. First off is a crown, which includes branches, twigs, the leaves or needles, flowers, and fruit. This is also where photosynthesis takes place, the process by which a tree takes in carbon dioxide and water, and through using light, converts that into sugar and oxygen. Trees also have a trunk that has bark and wood, which supports the crown and protects it from external forces. Lastly, they have roots that absorb nutrients and water from the soil and anchor them to the ground. So beyond the different parts of a tree, we also have two main groups that they fall into: conifers and deciduous. So conifers are defined as trees that bear cones, while deciduous are trees that lose their leaves every year. Other characteristics include needle or scale-like leaves that typically stay on year-round. This is why conifers are also called evergreen trees. On the other hand, deciduous trees have flat or wide leaves, and this is why they're often called broadleaf trees. And you might think this neatly divides all species into one category or the other. But one native exception that we have is the tamarack, which is a deciduous conifer. This simply means that while it has needles and cones, it actually loses the needles every year. So with that fun tidbit aside, conifers also include pines, spruces, and firs, while deciduous trees include things like maples, ashes, and poplars, just to name a few. With so much diversity, this means that different trees have adapted to living in various kinds of environments. This is important to note because different species and the forest ecologies that they are a part of are better suited for certain management practices than others. But wait, forests are incredibly complex. So before any kind of management can take place, one key part of the process is to conduct an inventory. Forest or tree inventories capture information like the species composition, size diversity, relative ages, and even health. This information can reveal things like the progression from previous harvesting or restoration projects that took place. The information is then used by foresters and other decision makers to craft a plan forward to appropriately manage the forest. So let's move on to the bulk of this workshop. One obvious skill required in order to conduct a tree inventory is the ability to identify the tree species. So while you won't be an expert at the end, I hope that this can serve as a starting point or a roadmap if it's something you're interested in practicing. So first off, your location is going to be an important indicator of what species you can expect to encounter. For example, if you are deep in the boreal forest, you'll likely come across plenty of conifers. So knowing how to differentiate between the spruces, firs, and pines will be really important. On the other hand, if you were in the Carolinian forests in southern Ontario, you'll come across things like beech, maples, hickories, and oaks. So knowing how to tell different deciduous trees apart will be really handy here. On a smaller scale, where you are within the forest can also influence what trees you'll see. If you're along the forest edge where there's a lot of sunlight, you'll find shade-intolerant species. As you move further into the forest and light becomes less available, you'll see a transition towards more mid to high shade-tolerant species. So now that you know where to find some of these species, what do they look like? Let's find out. So here I'll cover just a few features of various species in Ontario, and we'll go through the features that you can use to identify them based on what we already named before from the tree parts. This includes the form or the shape of the crown, the bark of the tree, the buds on the twigs, leaves, flowers, and fruit. So some species have very telltale characteristics, but others are a little bit more obscure. So it's always good to confirm a number of different features before settling on an ID, because different trees might look very similar if you're going off of just one aspect. Also keep in mind that there's always going to be exceptions to what I'm presenting, because not everything likes to or has to conform to these general ID tips. So take the photos here with a grain of salt, because you might encounter something that varies pretty wildly from the images. And in this section, I'll just briefly touch upon some key features for the species on the screen, rather than going through everything for that one species. Otherwise, we'd be here for hours. I'll also list the common name and the scientific name of the tree, since there are some trees that go by the same common name, but they're actually different types. So first off here for white pine, it has a very distinctive form that looks windswept. It also has a tendency to peek through the canopy of the forest, and it'll probably be one of the tallest trees. Next, we have paper birch. And like its name, it has very thin, papery-like bark that comes off in strips. For red oak, like other oak species, it has a cluster of terminal buds at the very tip of the branch. Tamarack, a deciduous conifer, will lose its leaves every year. Tulip tree, like its name, has very distinct tulip-like flowers. And American beech has fruit in very spiky husks that will split open to reveal what's inside. So starting off with tree form, it's safe to say that conifers will adopt a very Christmas tree-like shape. This is also known as an excurrent form, where there's one strong leader. Deciduous trees, on the other hand, have a rounder shape, which is also known as decurrent, where there isn't any one branch that's leading the growth. So here we have white spruce, white oak, and American elm. With American elm, its branches will start to droop down as it matures, giving it an upside-down vase shape. Where a tree grows can also affect its form. So here we have two red pines. The one on the left is growing out in the open with no competition, so it's quite stout and the branches are quite wide. On the other hand, the other pine on the right is growing alongside trees that are also really tall, and this forces it to grow tall as well, so that it can get as much sunlight as possible. Bark can be challenging, but there are some key things that give it away. That's the color, its texture, whether it's flaky, peels off in strips, or if it's smooth, and even the patterns in the ridges. So with yellow birch, its bark is very bronze, a little bit shiny, and it'll peel off in strips. For trembling aspen, it's white and very smooth, and then with red pine, its scaly bark will flake off. Also keep in mind that the bark of a tree can look very different depending on the age. So a sapling might have very smooth bark when it's young, but once it starts to mature, it can develop very deep furrows or ridges. Buds can also be very distinct, but a little bit challenging if the tree is tall or during a time when it's blooming or leafing out. If you get your hands on a twig and you can see the buds, look out for the size, shape, color, and hair on the buds. Related to this is also the branching arrangement, where a handful of trees you'll encounter will have opposite branching and everything else will have alternate. So as a beginner, an acronym you can use to remember which species have opposite arrangement is MAD horse, M-A-D horse, which stands for maples, ashes, dogwoods, and horse chestnut. You can also look towards the smell or the taste of a branch. So if you come across something, you have a sudden urge to put it in your mouth and take a bite. If you notice a wintergreen flavor, then you might have a yellow birch on hand. If you come across a maple and it's a little bit bruised, you notice there's an unpleasant odor, you might have a silver maple. So here on the left, we have a sugar maple. And similar to the green ash, they both have opposite arrangement. Again, recalling back to the acronym MAD horse. With sugar maple, its buds are very pointy. Other native maples have somewhat rounded buds, so they're less sharp. Green ash here has some very fine hair on the buds. Other native ash species will either lack the hair or have darker bud colors. With beech, its buds are very narrow, long, and quite sharp. Black walnut, similar to green ash, has very fuzzy buds. The difference here is that black walnut will have alternate leafing arrangements, while green ash is opposite. Then, lastly, there's basswood, with very distinct, large, red buds. Moving on to leaves. Leaves are the easiest way to start IDing a tree. The first set of leaf types we'll be looking at are needles. So pine trees have the longest needles. They're all very pointy and always bundled together in groups of 2, which will include most pines, and bundles of 3, which include ponderosa or pitch pine, or 5, which includes white pine. In the middle, we have spruce needles. And the trick to remembering if you're coming across a spruce tree is 4 S's. So spruce needles are short, they're sharp, they're square, and the single needles are attached to the branch. Firs and hemlocks have flat, blunt needles that are also individually attached to the branch, with hemlocks having much shorter needles than balsam fir. There are also scales that you can think of as shingles on a roof. They can be flat, like in eastern white cedar, or rounded and quite sharp, like in juniper. With deciduous leaves, things are a little bit more complicated. First, you'll want to determine if the leaf is simple or compound. So with simple, the leaf is directly attached to the branch. But in compound, you have multiple leaflets, or things that look like mini leaves that will be attached to a petiole or a long leaf stem, which is then attached to the branch. Other things to take note of include the overall shape of the leaf or leaflets and how the tip or the base comes together. So here on the screen, I've listed some basic shapes you'll come across, but if you do a quick Google search, you'll likely find more complicated diagrams, which can be a bit overwhelming. So this is a really good point to start off with. Lastly, you'll want to look at the edges or the margin of the leaf, and this can help distinguish very similar species from each other. So if it's smooth, serrated, or toothed, wavy, or lobed. And in the case of lobed, it simply means that parts of the leaf will stick out from the body. Here I've listed some species with varying characteristics we just covered, and I'll walk you through them. So for sugar maple, it has a simple leaf, and it has 5 lobes. Other native maples also have this overall shape and have between 3 to 5 lobes, depending on what you're looking at. For ash, this has a compound leaf with 9 or so leaflets. Other tree species that also have compound leaves will include walnuts and hickories. And remind me, what's that acronym again that we can use to tell the species based on if it's opposite or alternate? It's mad horse. That's right. So moving on to American elm. There are 2 things to note here. So the base of this leaf, you can see it's asymmetric, where one side is lower than the other. And if we look at the edges, you'll see that it's serrated or toothed. An interesting thing here is that it's actually double serrated, where each serration or tooth has some more fine teeth or edges to it. And lastly, there's red oak, which has 7 or so lobes. And if you look at the tips, you'll see they end in very sharp points. Other oak species will have 5 to 11 lobes, depending on which type you're looking at. And oaks are also divided into 2 groups, the red oak group and the white oak group. Red oak groups, which include the red oak, black oak, and pin oak, will all have lobes that end in these pointy tips. On the other hand, the white oak group, which includes white oak, bur oak, and swamp white oak, will have lobes that are smooth all around. So they'll look similar to this in shape, but instead of having pointed edges, they're very smooth. Finally, what the flowers or fruit look like can also indicate its species. You'll want to see the size, shape, the color, sometimes the fragrance, the number, and even the timing of the flower or the fruit. Basswood's very distinct because its flowers hang down from this leaf-like structure called a bract. With white oak, you have acorns, and the size and shape of the acorn will vary depending on the species you're looking at. Lastly, we have tamarack cones, and this is very distinctive, very different from things like a pine cone. And it can be easy to tell, especially in the winter, because they'll lack leaves. So it's just a naked branch with these little cute cones on them. So what if after looking at a tree and trying everything you can to identify the different features, but you're still stumped, and pun totally intended? Thankfully, there are some resources available that can help you in your IDing journey. So apps like LeafSnap or iNaturalist can help you identify a tree based on an image of it. There are also a number of atlases or tree identification books available for download or purchase. And if you get your hands on a field guide, oftentimes they'll have something called a dichotomous key that you can use to narrow down what species you might be looking at. So this is a perfect segue into the next big part of the workshop. What is a dichotomous key? It's basically a flowchart, but instead of being a graphic, you go through a series of descriptive sentences that present you with 2 choices. Based on which one you pick, you simply go down the subset of characteristics until you land at a species. So let's walk through an example to make sure you can navigate one. So let's say you're in a park, you come across this tree. You've narrowed it down to a pine because its needles come in bundles, but you're just not sure what kind of pine it is. So you pull out your field guide book, you open your dichotomous key to the section for pine trees, and you get to work. You'll see that the first step here, both of the characteristics beside the number 1, will focus on the leaf bundles. So you walk up to the branch and you take a look. You'll determine whether the leaves are in bundles of 5 or in bundles of less than 5. I'll give you a moment to determine that from looking at the picture. And if you guess the second option, you're right. So what we do now is we select that, and we move on to the next set of characteristics underneath it. And here you'll notice that they begin with the same number, in this case 6. This is done as a way to keep the same set or subset of characteristics together. So now moving on to the characteristics that start with 6, are the leaves typically in bundles of 3 or in bundles of 2? They're in bundles of 2, and you can see that especially with the needles at the bottom of the branch. So again, selecting that, we'll move on to the characteristics underneath it. Are the leaves longer than 7 centimeters and straight, or are they shorter than 7 centimeters and twisted or divergent? So you take out a ruler and you start measuring some of the needles. You notice that they're all shorter than 7 centimeters. And another nice thing is that they appear somewhat twisted, but they're not kind of spiraling or coiled up. So both of those line up really nicely with our second option. And again, we'll simply move down to the section underneath that, and we'll keep going away to determine what species it is. So now we're presented with whether or not the leaves are scarcely spread apart and spirally twisted, or they spread apart to form a V, and they're only slightly twisted. Great. So you see that the needles will start to spread apart at the very base of the bundle, and they do form a V. And now from here, we start to look at some more characteristics, but going beyond just the leaves. So with this branch here, you see that they're dark green, but the needles on some other branches look a little bit yellowish green. So you're not sure between the two which option it'll be. Moving on to other features, it lists descriptions for cones. Lucky you, you have a cone right beside you. So you start taking a look and you notice that this cone is pretty wonky. It's a little lopsided, and right now it's just sitting by itself. You notice in the Dichotomous Key, it lists whether the cones are mostly in pairs or in groups of more than 2. So you take a look at the other cones on the tree, and you see that they come mostly in pairs. So now, based on that description, do you think it's a jack pine or a mugo pine? If you settled on jack pine, you're correct. And what you can do now is flip to the page that's associated with that species, listed on the right-hand side there, and just double check your ID and match up some other characteristics. So now you have the Dichotomous Key achievement unlocked, and you can navigate one if you have to in the future. Moving on to something a little bit more technical now. Another aspect of tree inventory is to measure the size of a tree. 2 things that are often recorded include the diameter at breast height, also known as the DBH, and the total height of the tree. 2 things that are used here include the DBH tape and the clinometer. So again, the DBH tape will be used to measure the DBH of a tree, and the breast height is defined as 1.3 meters from the ground. One side of the DBH tape will have the diameter calculations, while the other side will have a regular ruler. How you measure the DBH will really depend on the tree, whether the trunk is straight, the slope of the ground, and if or where the trunk forks. This handy diagram here illustrates the different methods you'll need to use in order to measure the DBH. So say you're going to measure this tree in front of you now. What are the steps you have to do? Well, first you'll want to measure the breast height, which is 1.3 meters from the ground. But keeping in mind that this may have to shift depending on what the tree looks like. Once you've landed on where you want to measure the tree, you simply latch the hook onto a ridge of the bark and you start to walk around it, making sure that the tape is straight so that it's not snagging up or down as you walk around, unlike the picture in the left. So once you've wrapped it all around, you just record the DBH. And this is simply where the tape will overlap with the 0 on the tape. So for those of you who have a clear view of your computer screen, which value is the DBH for the image on the right? Is it 149 or Or is it 151.5? If you shouted 151.5, you're right. And congratulations! You now know how to measure the DBH of a tree. So moving on to the height. Here, you'll often use something called a clinometer. And a clinometer will measure the height of an object using the angle from a horizontal plane when you look either up or down at the object, and using a little bit of math to incorporate the distance that you are from that object. There are various clinometers that I've seen, and here on the right I've listed the ones that I often come across. So if you're lucky, there'll be some clinometers that have the pre-calculated height measurements based on a 20 or 15 meter distance away from the object and the percentage for safe measure. But if you're less lucky, you might come across a clinometer that just has the degree and the percent. So the face of your clinometer is important because it'll tell you which value in the eye hole corresponds to which scale. So again, if you have a clinometer with the pre-calculated height, for instance, you're looking at the scale on the far left, that will be the measurements for the height of an object that's 20 meters away from you. Take note of this because it's going to determine what kinds of calculations you'll need to do. And this piece is the eye hole, so when you look through it, this is what you'll encounter. Again, depending on the kind you have, you'll either have a pair of numbers or 3 sets of them. There's also going to be a horizontal line straight across that simply helps you align what you're looking at. So let's go through how to use a clinometer. First, you'll want to place it right in front of one eye and keep both eyes open when you're looking at the object. You'll want to line the crosshair with the point of what you're measuring by moving your entire head up or down, not just your eye. Hopefully, you'll have something that looks like the image under number 3, and you simply need to record the correct value. Then you just do a little bit of math to determine the height of your object. So now I'll walk through the calculations based on the different kinds of clinometers you might use. So for this one, which has the calculated height value at a 15 or 20 meter distance, you'll first have to walk back either 15 or 20 meters from the tree, whichever measurement that will allow you to see the top of the tree clearly. Then you line the crosshair with the tree top and record the corresponding value. You do the same with the tree base and record that as your second value. Now, depending on where the tree base is, if it's below your eye level when you're looking straight ahead, then you add the 2 values together. If it's above, you simply subtract the second value from the first. So here I've put some diagrams that will illustrate what I'm explaining. So with this tree, you've walked back 15 meters, looking at the top, and you record the 15 meter measurement. That value will be 10. When you look down at the tree base, you get a value of 3.5. Since you had to look down, what you need to do is add the 2 heights together in order to get the height of the tree. Now for this one, you've walked back 20 meters. When you look up at the top of the tree, the measurement for the 20 meter distance is 18. When you look at the base of the tree, you note that you just have to tilt your head up ever so slightly, but you still get a recording of 2 meters. And in this instance, what you do is you subtract them. So 18 subtract 2 is 16 meters, which would be the height of the tree. For a percent value calculation, it's a little bit more complicated, but there's freedom in the distance that you'll have to be from the tree. So here you can go back any number you want as long as you get to see the top of the tree clearly. It can be 23 meters, 32, 48, whatever you're comfortable with and have space for. Once you're at a good distance, just take note of that. Next, from where you're standing, you line up the crosshair with the top of the tree, and then you record that percent. Then you multiply it by the distance in order to obtain the first value. Next, you do the same with the tree base. So you line up the crosshair with the bottom of the tree, record that percent, multiply it by the distance, and then you get the second value. And similar to before, if the tree base is below your eye level, you add the two values. If it's above, you subtract the second value from the first. So in this example, we've walked back 25 meters. Looking at the top, you record 48%. Doing a little bit of math, 48% of 25 gives you 12. Doing the same thing for the bottom, you get 8%, multiplied by 25, you get 2. So if you've been paying attention, do you now add or subtract the values? You would add it. So the height of the tree would be 14 meters. What about this scenario? You've walked back 28 meters, and looking at the top, you get a reading of 65%. That gives you a value of 18.2. So now you look at the base of the tree, which gives you 13%. The value there would be 3.6. Now do you add or subtract? You would subtract. And so the height of the tree would be 14.6 meters tall. Now with using the degree value, it's going to be very similar to percentage. But rather than multiplying the percent by the distance, in this case, we would have to multiply the degree by tan, and then multiply that value by the distance. So the steps are very similar to before, we just have an extra multiplication that we have to do. So here, you've walked back 45 meters. Looking at the top of the tree, you get a reading of 35 degrees. You'll multiply that by tan, and then you multiply that by your distance, which gives you your initial value of 31.5. Afterwards, looking down at the base of the tree, you get 10 degrees. Doing your math, you'll end up with 8.1. If you're getting the hang of this, or if you're picking up on the pattern, you'll note that the next thing to do here is you add the two. So the height of the tree would be just under 40 meters tall. Now what about this scenario here? So you've walked back 35 meters. Looking at the top, you get a reading of 60 degrees. Doing your calculations, you end up with 60.6. So now looking at the base with 8 degrees, multiply by tan, multiply by your distance of 35 meters, you get 4.9. And can you tell me, do you add or subtract? You would subtract. This would give you a height of 55.7 meters. But one thing to be aware of is that it can be a little bit challenging to see the top of the tree from where you're standing. What you think is the top might actually just be a branch that's sticking out towards you. This gives off the illusion that it's the top. And the danger here is that you may end up with a height measurement that's way off from the value of the tree, because you're mistaking the branch for the actual tip. To get around this, if possible, try to walk around and see different angles of the tree just to be sure you're actually getting the top. For something like a deciduous tree, where it might be a little bit more difficult, do your best to see through the canopy and guess where the top is. Like tree ID, doing tree measurements is also something that you learn to get the hang of over time. So don't sweat it if it's a bit challenging at first. Practice does make perfect after all. And that's it for this workshop. Hopefully now you're equipped with some knowledge and skills associated with the really small aspect of forestry, and in my opinion, one of the most fun parts as well. This is also a starter pack for anyone who's interested in studying this field. So thank you so much for tuning into this workshop with me. Here I've listed some resources that I found really useful over the years, which include an extensive glossary for some technical language you might come across, online tree or woody plant ID resources, and the 2 apps that I mentioned earlier, along with really useful ID books. I've also listed my email, so please feel free to reach out if you have any questions about this workshop. I would be absolutely thrilled to talk about all things trees. So please send in any inquiries you have my way. Thank you again for tuning in, and I hope that this inspires you to become buds with all the leafy neighbors in your community.